I'm going to give you right now a bit of a history of the English language to explain why the language is so odd, goofy, and contradictory, and really why many of those rules that you learned in high school have so many exceptions, where they seem not to hold any value at all. You've probably noticed that already. The history explains a lot of the problems people run into. So let me go through it, and I'll call this kind of a bad history to go along with a bad grammar, because I'm going to do this in a very general way and skip a lot of the nuances of the history that would probably drive somebody crazy if you really know the details. There are some links up there that will guide you through a more detailed history if you want to do that, but you really don't need to. But if you're interested in where the language came from, how it got so goofy, some of those links can walk you through it. First of all, again, this is a history of the English language, and I should say it's going to be my kind of quick and dirty history of it. And I break it down into four periods, four primary periods to really explain the major forces behind the language and how it got to be the way it is today. So if you keep these four periods in mind, it will explain most of what you see in the language today. First of all, the Old English period. This runs generally from around 500 AD to 1066. This is the period, if you had in high school, if you had Beowulf, this is that period. You probably know if you had Beowulf, you had to read a translation. And essentially at this time, English is a dialect of German. It is closely related to German in much the same way Portuguese is related to Spanish today. And really they are related to French and to Italian and even to Romanian. But at this time period, English is really not so much a distinct language from German, but a close relative, a very close relative. Now, as the period goes on, keep in mind we're talking about a period that's really over 500 years in length. The language does evolve and change and break off. There are numerous invasions from the Danes and the Vikings and others that we're dealing with. So it is a very complicated period, but the thing to keep in mind is it is a distinct language to such a degree that we can't understand it today. That if you were to try to read Beowulf in the original, you couldn't understand it. I'll tell you, interestingly enough though, a modern German today could make far more sense out of Beowulf than you could today, even though it's considered to be an Old English epic. And it really was the beginning of what would become the English language. At this time period, there wasn't much writing, however. So Beowulf was one of the first written down poems. There are a few others, but Beowulf was around. Bede was around, would write down a history of the English-speaking peoples, but he did so in Latin. So the English language at this time period was really a form of German. Things would change then in 1066. A nobleman by the name of William the Bastard, you may have heard him called William the Conqueror, but when he invaded England, he was known as William the Bastard. He came from northern France, and he essentially marched from one end of England up to the north, from the south end up to the north end of England, and declared it his own. He's coming from a French background, though, and what he really initiated was a Frenchification, or really a takeover of this German language by what was really a Romance language. By Romance we mean it has a Roman history to it. And when you mix French with what is essentially a dialect of German, you get something radically different. This is not like mixing Spanish and Portuguese, two close relatives, and it's certainly not like mixing Danish and German together, which was already happening during this time period. Instead, you have two radically different language families coming into very close contact with each other and mixing with each other. French at this time period became the dominant language of the royalty at this time. And it really trickled down into the common language, which remained English, this dialect of German. What started to happen was this mixing and this forced mixing of these two languages that came from very different language families. Well, the English language changed dramatically, and keep in mind this took place in England. It didn't take place back in France, which went on speaking French. Instead, what was happening in England was this radical transformation of the language. It basically took place between 1066 and 1400, and most of the radical changes that we really saw in the language took place in this time. I know people think today that language is changing more rapidly than it ever did before. This is really not true, because writers from this period could not read writers from this period. The language had changed that dramatically. In fact, if we take the most famous writer from the French period, who is Chaucer, you can read Chaucer in his original writing, in his London dialect. You can read him in the exact same way he wrote at that time period. Chaucer could not read Beowulf. He would not have had any hope with reading Beowulf any more than you would have. In fact, you have a more developed vocabulary than Chaucer did. Chaucer had a more limited vocabulary because of the time period and because the language simply had not developed as much as far as vocabulary is concerned. But Chaucer, as great as a genius as he was, could not have read Beowulf. He would have read Latin, Greek, and Italian classics, and French too. We know he was conversant in French, so he was an ambassador. But keep in mind how dramatically the language changed in this time period, and it especially changed in the vocabulary. Most of the words that we have for government, even the word government itself, actually come from French origins. Most of the words we have for government come from that French origin. About 40% of the language today, and it depends on how you count the words really in the end, but approximately about 40% of the language today has its origins in French. And so we picked up an enormous amount of our vocabulary from this French period and mixed it with the German we already had. And really at this time period, English was a combination of German, Dutch, and Norse, and other languages. At this time period, French came in and brought in an entirely new vocabulary, affected some of the structures of it and other things, and really revolutionized the language. I often say about this time period, it's like mixing the rules of hockey and basketball together and mixing the language of hockey and basketball together, and that's what you had with English at this time. It wasn't a rule book that was really planned out and thought through. It was a rule book that got created by history. And it's a rule book that's going to run into a lot of conflicts and other issues and create a lot of problems. And it really happened with this time period. If you know Spanish, you probably know that Spanish is much more logical than English, especially in the spelling. Most English speakers can in fact spell better in Spanish than they can in English. English is really crazy in its spelling rules, very crazy. We have words like phone, if you've ever thought about that word. That's actually a Greek word origin. And then we have words like enough, that's the same F sound with O-U-G-H. And then we have words that actually begin with the letter F that have that F sound. English does that crazy kind of stuff because the rules were so mixed up during the French period. Okay? Now, during the Renaissance period, and I'm really moving rapidly through these, I would probably give a historian a heart attack, but this is really to catch the major shifts in the language. During the Renaissance period, and I'm going to run it from 1400 to 1900, that would give most historians a heart attack. But what happened during this time period is England became a world power. As a world power, Europe at this time was dominated by England and Spain. Europe was dominated by England and Spain at the beginning of the Renaissance. And most of you know of Queen Elizabeth in Shakespeare. But who also existed are people like Isaac Newton, Raleigh, and others who were expanding the language in its reach. England was becoming a colonial power and reaching throughout the world. Most of you probably know that Hong Kong was part of England's colonial outreach. They went out to Hong Kong, they went to India, they of course went to North America and other places, and the language and the ideas were expanding rapidly. And so the language needed to expand with all this expansion in geography, politics, and scientific knowledge. And what it did was to reach out to two other languages to build its new vocabulary, which were Greek and Latin. So you'll see most of the knowledgeable and educated vocabulary that you'll learn as a college student is actually based in Greek and Latin. I know certainly nursing students know this, and if you're in a medical field or biological science, you're going to see a lot of Greek terms coming into the language. If you're going into a legal field or anything related to the law, you're going to see a lot of Latin terms. But this didn't just happen in those fields, it happened throughout the language. So we saw a lot of introduction of Greek and Latin in the terminology, but also keep in mind we saw a lot of the rules for spelling come in during this time. In fact, the first English dictionary was created right before Shakespeare died. Shakespeare actually spelled his name in 4, maybe I've heard 5 different ways during his lifetime. Nobody thought anything of it. When you start regularizing the language, which they started to do during the Renaissance period, you have to keep in mind they were trying to regularize these 3 different strains that were going into the English language. The English period, which brought up all these Germanic elements, the French period, which brought in all these French elements and ultimately Latin, and then the Renaissance period, which brought in classical Latin and Greek. And all of these were mixed together. This is why the language looks so crazy on the surface. It's because of these 3 periods got mixed during the Renaissance period, and really what happened was it started here. In 1066, the rule book really got mixed up, and it was never really put back together again. Why could they introduce Greek and Latin? Because the rule book was already a hockey basketball rule book. You can bring anything you want to this game because it's hockey basketball. Okay? So really the modern period, and again I'm defining it as 1900 to the present, the shift is that really the general population now can read and write and contribute to the language. And they're not so much contributing the technical and sophisticated vocabulary, but the common vocabulary is now making it into the language. The common language that we speak and hear on the street is often ending up in print. And that's the big change during the modern period. Now, most of this language you're not going to be using in your anthropology classes and other things. So I would argue that this period is probably the least important for what you're doing in college and learning about the language. It's probably the least important. Most of your vocabulary and grammar was already settled by 1900. This is the vocabulary and grammar you're going to use as an academic, as an educated person. It was already decided before you were born. Okay? This time period is really about the modern vocabulary that we use to get along with our friends, that we use in text messaging, and that we use at Facebook or anywhere else. There is, as you could probably, you probably recall from my discussion on dialects, absolutely nothing wrong with modern vocabulary at all. It's always a matter of determining, does it belong in an academic context? Is it a part of standard written English? Sometimes it is, oftentimes it's not. It's not a matter of right and wrong, it's a matter of does it fit the context. So the big thing to understand with the history is that it directly affected the vocabulary and especially the spelling of English. You can see it there immediately in any selections of words. You're going to see on any written page in the language you use a variety of sources for English vocabulary and for the rules of spelling. This gives people often the impression that English is an anything-goes language. In spelling and vocabulary, it really almost can be like that. In fact, the language is so large, by some counts, it's 8 times larger than other languages, other modern languages such as Spanish and French. By some counts, by almost any count, it's larger than any other modern language. That's because anything could come into the language. But in the grammar that I'm going to be covering this semester, it's not quite such an anything-goes Wild West show. The grammar does and has always followed a good logical pattern. That logic is often difficult to follow, but once you get it down, and that's going to be the focus of my grammar and my approach to grammar, is that we're going to focus on the structure of the language, not on the vocabulary. The reality is, technologically, you have spell check. It's going to catch your spelling issues. The reality is also you don't really care where the words came from. In most cases you don't, unless you're like me and really like this stuff. Maybe you are. Most folks don't. This is not as important, especially for this class. This is. If you're going to understand how to develop sentences, how to develop your ideas, it's always going to be based in the grammar itself. It's very difficult to think outside of language. You can do it. It is very possible. You can think spatially and in colors and other ways. But most of you are going to be thinking your ideas in language. And you're immediately going to be accessing grammar, especially when you're expressing those ideas and explaining them. My goal for this grammar is to give you a good idea of how to structure and restructure and develop your ideas to clarify them. It's not going to be a matter of right and wrong, because our grammar today is quite different than Shakespeare's, quite different than than Chaucer's, and especially different than, say, the Beowulf poets. And they weren't wrong. They were just writing in different time periods and different dialects. Instead, what I'm going to try to emphasize here is that the grammar I'm going to be promoting with you is going to be a grammar you can use. It's not a matter of right and wrong. It's a grammar of utility. And it's a grammar also of style. Knowing how those rules work will give you a better grasp on your ideas, how to explain them, how to develop them, and how to make them more precise, but also to be aware of the style you use as you're writing it, because you can never get away from your style. Okay? Hope that's clear for now. You get a cheap and quick history of it. If you want to go to the other links regarding the history of it, you can explore it a little bit more. But that's really optional. It's up to you. Okay? Take care.